Welcome back to Stories with Dave. This is another installment in a short series I'm doing related to canonical studies. This is a paper for which I won an award in '98 for excellence in research. It is unpublished. I'm basically calling into question the source material for The Great Gatsby. In other words, where was the inspiration for the story? And I think you'll be surprised at my conclusions. I hope you enjoy it. A romantic's dilemma posed possible influence on The Great Gatsby. Much of the scholarship written in this most recent resurgence of Poe studies has endeavored to place Poe once and for all as an American in an American literary continuum. Given Poe's literary proximity to Europe, and in particular to England, such an endeavor demands that we examine not only his sources, but his successors, specifically those who are American and made European stories American by rewriting them. Proving influence is tricky business, however, achieved most easily in broad strokes and where textual analysis is concerned, often clouded by legacies of bias among literary scholars. If we're not careful, we tend to find within influence studies the same kind of crutch Poe found in his obsession with plagiarism. If we choose to see Joseph Conrad's influence in a recipe for cheesecake, for instance, then we will surely find him there, on a boat, with his doppelganger. Conversely, if we're careful, we may find specific textual evidence with which to draw a definite literary genealogy, and in doing so, perhaps further legitimize contextual biographical links suggested by some scholars. Both broad and specific contextual and artistic links have been established between Poe and any number of his successors, but none as clearly as that between Edgar Allan Poe and F. Scott Fitzgerald. That Fitzgerald knew of Poe is indisputable. In fact, Fitzgerald was first exposed to literature during his childhood when his father read aloud to him from the poetry of Byron and Poe. According to Andrew Turnbull in Scott Fitzgerald, their mystery echoed in his soul, and on a trip to Niagara, he heard enchanting voices in the dusk. Fitzgerald also mentions Poe in several personal letters, one of which he describes the unique pleasure he took in walking through Baltimore, where Poe is buried. In yet another letter, a thank you note written to his attorney, Edgar Poe, who was supposedly a descendant of the poet, Fitzgerald finds an opportunity to spoof Ulalume when he writes, "The dressing gown is a beautiful piece of lechery. Thank you. I shall name it Celluloom and shall think in its depths." Critics past and present have made much of the biological similarities between the two. As striking as those similarities are, we can find them to varying degrees among any number of American writers. He was a relative failure in military service, or was forced by circumstances to join some obscure foreign branch, or wanted to serve but couldn't. He drank a lot. He had issues with women, which may or may not have been the result of childhood traumas. He waged war with the publishing industry, or the film industry, or the magazine industry, the word industry. And as interesting as they are, such comparisons weigh as literary evidence only insofar as the given authors wrote from their own lives. Even then, the discussion remains scholastic until we can tie it down with hard, specific literary evidence. In his essay on Poe's influence on later writers, Jeffrey Myers establishes strong textual links between Fitzgerald's The Diamond as Big as the Ritz and Poe's The Fall of the House of Usher. And Fitzgerald himself has shown us Poe's influence on him in his use of Ulalume and This Side of Paradise. What little has been written on Poe's influence on The Great Gatsby has been suggested by Elizabeth Casper Aldrich. While she makes a valid case, the structure of which will appear in part of this paper, she has spread herself thin, drawing on textual elements from three of Poe's tales, The Oval Portrait, The Hall of the House of Usher, and William Wilson, when the same elements can be found in one, The Assignation. If we examine the three main characters in The Assignation for Poe's signature within them, we will find the points of comparison we need to show that The Assignation is a viable text from which to begin source studies on The Great Gatsby. The use of first-person narrative is as old as storytelling. The use of first-person narrative voice that's not that of the protagonist, however, is certainly characteristic of Poe. It's a device he used again and again in his short fiction, and one that we might consider to be a signature of his work. It's just this device that enabled Poe to achieve the degree of ambiguity he did in so much of his short fiction. The narrator rarely has a name, and we must usually guess at his identity using implicit and explicit clues found elsewhere in the text. Through him, everything is hinted at, and nothing is asserted. All we ever really know about the biography of the narrator in the Assignation is what we learn by inference. We can assume he's either American or European, that he's a man of some means, at least he has enough leisure to be in a gondola in Venice at midnight. If he's married, he does not say. He's certainly educated, or so we can infer from his references to classical antiquity and from his broad knowledge of culture and fine art. He has little trouble appreciating the wealth of beauty that surrounds him in the protagonist's eclectic, opulent apartment. Quote, the eye wandered from object to object and rested upon none, neither the grotesques of the Greek painters nor the sculptures of the best Italian days, nor the huge carvings of untutored Egypt. Even more important than his overall knowledge of art, however, is his application of it in his narrative. When he describes the characters in the tale, he invariably does so in terms of art, and in particular in terms of sculpture. He describes the Marchesa Aphrodite as statue-like, with a classical head showered with gems, and with a figure draped in a raiment which, quote, hung about it as the heavy marble hangs around the Nile. Probably didn't pronounce that right. The narrator describes the protagonist in terms of art as well, and it is in these descriptions, both physical and philosophical, that we can best understand the relationship between the narrator and the protagonist. In his physical description, the narrator, besides providing hints that the protagonist could be Lord Byron, once again makes a comparison with a statue. The protagonist's features are, quote, classically regular, and more so than any the narrator has seen, other than the statue of Emperor Commodus. The philosophical descriptions, which we find at the very beginning of the narrative, are far more telling with regard to their relationship. He begins with a typically romantic musing on the protagonist, whom he describes first in terms of his imagination, and in doing so, the narrator reveals that he too is an artist, a romantic artist, in that he struggles with the incongruity of the real and the ideal, what is and what should be. Then he essentially apologizes for what we will later learn was the protagonist's suicide. He sees it as the natural, perhaps inevitable result of the departed's romantic passion for supernal beauty. Who then shall call thy conduct into question? Who blame thee for thy visionary hours, or denounce those occupations as a wasting away of life, which were the overflow of thine everlasting energies? It is this commiseration, if you will, that suggests to the reader the narrator is to an extent the protagonist's double. They are alike in almost every aspect. They are both bachelors, both men of the world. They both appreciate fine art, and more importantly, both see the world through eyes of a romantic artist. What we will find as we examine the final two main characters in the Assignation is that the tale itself is about an artist and his subject, or more precisely, what happens to a romantic artist who idealizes his subject in the name of supernal beauty, thereby transmuting her to art and beckoning catastrophe. The narrator is simply a doppelganger of sorts, who serves as a vehicle to describe that relationship in particularly artistic terms. Whether the protagonist is indeed Lord Byron or not, he's surely Byronic. He is autonomous, young, moody, in constant struggle with the demands of the real versus the vision of the ideal. It is his vision, his identity as an artist, that must have prompted Poe to name the piece The Visionary when he first penned it. Both physical and contextual descriptions of the protagonist suggest that he is based on the very person of Lord Byron. He is described as, quote, the graceful person of a very young man, with the sounds of whose name the greater part of Europe was then ringing, and as below rather than above the medium size, with curling black hair. Later, the narrator reveals that the protagonist, despite his insistence to the contrary, was not only born but also educated in England. The narrator comes to this conclusion after reading a poem written by the protagonist. Whether he is Byron, however, is not as important as the fact that he is a Byronic character, and as such, an artist of particularly romantic temper. That he is an artist becomes clear in his love of and familiarity with fine art, and in his own admission of having been a decorist. The greater part of the tour on which he takes his privileged narrator is devoted to explaining the art and artifacts he has collected to display in his Bower of Dreams. And during the tour, he makes reference to a quote by Michelangelo and to the Apollonian philosophy of art as it was put by Socrates. that the sculptor can see the finished sculpture, or what might be, in the uncut slab of natural marble, and that he can see what could be the ideal within what is the real. This obsession with reconciling the real and the ideal was central to the English Romantic movement and to our protagonist, who finds much of the world reality ludicrous, and who spends a great deal of his time brooding or dreaming. He has a, quote, habit of intense and continual thought, pervading even his most trivial actions, end quote. And he hears, or so speculates the narrator, quote, sounds which must have had existence in his mind alone, end quote. He himself admits his tendency to dream, to become lost in his imagination, when he says to the narrator that to dream has been the business of my life, that his spirit is writhing in fire, and that the delirium of this scene is fashioning for me the wilder visions of that land of real dreams whither I am rapidly departing. We cannot truly understand the narrator in the Assignation without first understanding the subject of his narration as a romantic artist. Similarly, we cannot truly understand the protagonist's dilemma with regard to the dichotomies of real and ideal, and past and future, until we understand the subject of his art, the Marchesa di Mentoni. In our first glimpse of the Marchesa di Mentoni, she's revealed to us as a work of art, as a woman of almost supernatural beauty. She is, as we've discussed with regard to the narrator, described in terms of sculpture, and it is with this description that we enter what Aldrich calls Poe's characteristic triangle of characters, in which we follow the treatment of the female character as transformed by the protagonist, and to an extent by the narrator, from woman to art, from real human to ideal symbol. Aldrich reduces this transformation to three stages: translation, transmutation, and catastrophe. In the first description of her, she's already been translated in terms of art. In other words, she's become less real and more ideal. She, quote, promises or inspires an excitement or pleasurable elevation of the soul, which verges on the inhuman, which in humanity, in any case, cannot sustain, close quote. The second stage, the transmutation, has indeed already occurred chronologically, though we're not made aware of it till the end of the tale. During the narrator's tour of the protagonist's apartment, he comes upon one painting he's not yet displayed, and which is covered up like something sacred. Describing the work, our narrator tells us that human art could have done no more in the delineation of her superhuman beauty, and that the painting of her is the perfection of the beautiful. In this perfection, the protagonist has succeeded in what the narrator has begun in his first depiction of her, and the Marchesa is no longer like art, but is art. The final transformative stage occurs at the very end of the tale, when we realize the Marchesa and the protagonist have committed suicide. This is the catastrophe, the inevitable consequence of the protagonist's inability to reconcile the real and the ideal. In short, then, we have the story of a Byronic hero, a romantic artist whose idealization of a woman, his subject, is described to us by a narrator who is also a kind of doppelganger of the Byronic hero and artist. We see in this idealization subject, the Marchesa, being translated in terms of art, and finally being transmuted into art itself, or in other words, into a symbol of supernal beauty. We see in this transmutation a sort of artistic, spiritual vampirism that costs both artists and subject their lives in a catastrophic event of self. We see in this transmutation a sort of artistic, spiritual vampirism that caused both artists and subject their lives in a catastrophe of suicide. Poe's signature in this tale is clear. The use of the first-person narrative non-protagonist is one of the most trusted and most often used narrative devices. That Poe descended at least in part from the English Romantic tradition is common knowledge among scholars, as is his affinity for Lord Byron, and therefore Byronic characters. Poe's idealization of women characters, and indeed women in his life, is also well known. It's so well known that it's almost redundant to mention it. As Poe himself has told us in the Philosophy of Composition, the most poetical subject in the world is the death of a beautiful woman. That these signatures or tendencies of Poe's exist in these three characters is important in that by finding Poe within Poe, we might then begin to find him elsewhere. With such evidence in hand, it's only a short leap from the Assignation to the Great Gatsby, from anonymous narrator to Nick Carraway, from Lord Byron to Byronic hero to J. Gatsby, from the Marchesa di Mentoni to Daisy Buchanan, and from their indifferent satyr-like Mentoni to Tom Buchanan. In both tales, three characters, or rather two characters and a character narrator, provide the basic framework for tension in the plot. In both tales, the protagonist idealizes the beauty of woman and, in the end, transmutes the object of his affection into a symbol of perfection. In both tales, the result of this transmutation is catastrophe. The evidence itself is glaring, precludes any need for in-depth point-by-point comparison. It suffices to say that we have two tales told by narrators who are also characters, and that in each tale, the protagonist, a wealthy young Byronic character with a gauzy past, is described as a dreamer or visionary, whose tragic flaw is his inability to reconcile the real and the ideal, and whose effort to do so ends in tragedy. Given how easily these two stories are compared, it's curious indeed to learn that Fitzgerald's first exposure to literature of any sort was when his father read to him from both Poe and Byron. It's also curious to consider how many possibilities exist for transposition in these two tales. The original title for the Assignation was The Visionary, which, as titles go, would have worked as well, if not better, than The Great Gatsby. And Poe's description of his narrator watching his protagonist gaze at the painting of Marchesa might as well be Fitzgerald's description of Nick Carraway's first encounter with J. Gatsby, as the latter stands at the end of his pier, his arms stretched outward toward the green light, the symbol of supernal beauty into which he has transmuted his subject, his ideal woman. My glance fell from the painting to the figure of my friend, and the vigorous words of Chapman's Bussy d'Amboise quivered instinctively on my lips. He is up there like a Roman statue. He will stand until death have made him marble. These similarities in characterization and plot are hardly conclusive of influence. While we can establish that Fitzgerald knew of Poe, and that he knew of him well enough to have used one of Poe's poems in his first novel, there's nothing in his letters or elsewhere that tells us that he, quote, found Gatsby in the Assignation. Furthermore, one could argue that since the biographies of these two authors are so similar, and since both are known to have written directly, overtly from the material of their lives, any textual similarities are mere coincidence. Still, the similarities stand, and they go deeper than the surface of the works in question. At the very least, they beg us to consider Aldrich's main contention, that we should look to Poe first when we're considering frames with which to understand the work of his best-known, most widely taught successor. In this, we can further establish Poe's place in the American literary tradition, and perhaps in future studies explain how Fitzgerald Americanized tales that originated in Britain.